Let's give you a live look right now at the Vatican as the head of the health department there has confirmed the cause of death for Pope Francis, a cerebral stroke that led to a coma and later heart failure. Francis died earlier today, just a day after Easter at the age of 88. Pope Francis became Pope in 2013 and was the Church's first Latin American pontiff and the first Jesuit Pope. Francis was the first Pope, as I mentioned, from Latin America, who helped to make the Catholic Church more inclusive. He was also known for his focus on the poor and the marginalized.
Rebecca Castor is in Washington with more on his final moments and the legacy he leaves behind.
Here at the nation's largest basilica, the black drapes are drawn to honor the life and legacy of Pope Francis. Thousands of mourners gathering in St. Peter's Square for a rosary prayer vigil, honoring the Holy Father.
We heard about it when we came in here, and yeah, it's pretty much devastated all of us.
The Pope's body was placed in a coffin during a ceremony attended by church officials. Next, he'll be transferred to St. Peter's Basilica as early as Wednesday for worshipers to pay their respects.
He's also a father for us, someone who cares for us, someone who represents unity. So when he passes, everyone feels it personally.
Pope Francis greeted with cheers Sunday as he made his way through St. Peter's Square, waving to the crowd from the Pope-mobile. It was his first public appearance since leaving the hospital in March, following a bout with double pneumonia. From the balcony of the Basilica, the Pope gave an Easter blessing, while an aide read his prepared address. It focused on peace and called for an end to conflicts, particularly in Gaza and Ukraine.
He wanted to come back home. He wanted to be with the people, and God granted him that special blessing.
Earlier that morning, the Pope had a brief meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance, who converted to Catholicism in 2019. Vance told the pontiff that he prays for him daily, and Francis gifted him chocolate Easter eggs for his children.
We're praying for the millions of Christians around the world who loved the Pope and admired him this morning.
Francis will be remembered for his humility. In one of his first acts as Pope, he turned down the palatial papal quarters in favor of a more modest residence at the Vatican. He was also considered progressive after decades of conservative leadership. He worked to make the church more welcoming and inclusive, and took a compassionate approach towards the LGBTQ community, famously saying, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about the sexual orientation of priests.
In his simplicity, in his humility, in his easygoingness, these were gifts that he stewarded so well.
As an example of his humility, Pope Francis simplified the funeral protocols for popes before his death. It's likely he'll be laid to rest within the week. At Catholic University in Washington, Rebecca Castor, Fox 32 Chicago.
President Trump, meanwhile, ordering flags to be flown at half-staff as a, quote, mark of respect for the memory of Pope Francis. The president also offering condolences via Truth Social, writing, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis. May God bless him and all who loved him." President Trump and First Lady Melania meeting Pope Francis at the Vatican back in 2017 during the president's first term. And as you just heard from Rebecca Castor, Vice President J.D. Vance met with Francis at the Vatican yesterday, posting to social media saying, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world."
In September 2015, Pope Francis became only the third pontiff in history to pay a visit to the White House. He was greeted by the former President Barack Obama and the First Family, and then Vice President Joe Biden and his family were also on the tarmac upon his arrival. And here's the video from that. And Biden remembered the Pope as, quote, unlike any who came before him, and says Francis will be remembered as among the most consequential leaders of our time. The Obamas called Francis a rare leader who made us want to be better people. In a statement they wrote, "In his humility and his gestures at once simple and profound, embracing the sick, ministering to the homeless, washing the feet of young prisoners, he shook us out of our complacency and reminded us that we are all bound by moral obligations to God and one another."
The death of the pontiff sets in motion a series of carefully orchestrated rites and rituals, some of which date back more than 2,000 years.
One tradition is the sede vacante period, and this is when the papal throne is empty because of the death or resignation of a pope. As part of the sede vacante period, the giant bronze doors to the apostolic palace are half closed and bells are rung. And during this time, visitors can still come using those half-closed doors.
While we are awaiting the date of the Pope's funeral, we do know there will be changes from past services.
Tia Ewing is here with more.
Well, Don and Scott, the burial plans for Pope Francis will differ drastically from his predecessors. In fact, the Pope changed the funeral rites last year, emphasizing humility and removing some of the pomp and circumstance. Today marks the start of a 9-day mourning period, which will be followed by a funeral service. During an interview back in 2023, Francis said he picked the Santa Maggiore Basilica in Rome for his final resting place. This was one of his favorite and most frequented churches. Francis will be the first pope in a century to be interred outside the Vatican. Another change is that the Pope won't be placed on an elevated platform in St. Peter's Basilica during the public viewing. Instead, his body and those of future popes will lie in state in a simple coffin. And just announced, President Trump says he and First Lady Melania Trump will be attending the funeral of Pope Francis in Rome. Former President George W. Bush was the last sitting U.S. president to attend a pontiff's funeral. That was for John Paul II in the year 2005.
Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Vatican's Camerlengo, will now oversee the Catholic Church until a new pope is elected. Farrell is a former bishop from Dallas, Texas. He left that position in 2017 to go to work in the Vatican. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, in 1947.
So what happens next? The Pope's death sets in motion a series of rituals and processes.
Senior correspondent with the National Catholic Reporter, Heidi Schlumpf, joining us now. Heidi, always good to see you, although not under these circumstances. Pope Francis, as you know, was a reformer. He was, by Vatican standards, unpredictable. How would you sum up his legacy?
Well, after a day of reading statements and memories from so many people, I think the legacy is large and really has affected not only the world leaders that you were citing in your stories, but also everyday Catholics. He really gave a feeling of optimism to people who had been frustrated with the church, a church that had been inward looking and caring only about doctrinal purity. And instead, along comes this breath of fresh air who cares about the least among us, who's always trying to be a field hospital to the hurting in the world. And for so many Catholics, Christians, and even non-Christians, that was really inspirational. So for his death, now to bring an end to his papacy is a very sad day for so many people.
It really is. And I remember when we chose Pope Francis. So tell us again about the process. How will the new Pope be chosen?
So, yeah, first we'll be very focused on celebrating the life of Pope Francis through the funeral services that you mentioned that I expect will happen probably by the end of this week. Then the cardinals around the world will be coming to Rome for this series of meetings that happen before the conclave, which is when the voting happens. In that series of meetings, there'll be a lot of speeches about what the church needs at this time. And cardinals, even those who are too old to vote in the conclave, will have a chance to get up and give interventions or speeches in which they can share their thoughts about what's needed in a new leader. And then as people who have watched the movie Conclave have learned, the secret rituals that happen in the Sistine Chapel where the voting happens will come next. And then we'll find out who our new leader is for the church.
And this is a much different world than it was in 2013 when we elected the last pope. How important, Heidi, is the geopolitical climate right now when it comes to the selection process?
Well, I think it's very important, and there was Pope Francis when he's supposed to be recuperating out talking about the need for peace in our world. I think he and all the leaders of the church, as well as everyday Catholics, are very concerned about the geopolitical situation, but they're also concerned about the internal church matters. And there's been a lot of a conflict in the church because while Pope Francis certainly had his fans and people who found him a breath of fresh air, there were also people in the church, especially in the U.S. church, who were not happy with the direction he was taking the church, who thought that he was bringing confusion or going too far in a liberal direction. And so I suspect that there will be some conflict as well about that in the discussions before the conclave and the voting. And once the voting happens, we'll know which direction the church will be going.
There is a list of 9 potential candidates that have been identified. So tell us about the requirements to be pope.
Well, you have to be careful about those lists of people they say are papabile or potentially to be pope, because that can be the kiss of death for any possibilities that you might be elected. So a cardinal can be older than 80 to become a pope, but you have to be under 80 to be voting. And I do believe that the range of people who have been named cardinals under Pope Francis represent a diversity, certainly geographically, than we haven't had before. So the number of cardinals from Europe and North America have declined under the Francis papacy, whereas other parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, have increased. Now, whether that will translate into a new pope who comes from one of those regions, it remains to be seen. But I think we have a very different group of men who will be making the decision than there were in 2013.
240 plus popes, not one of them ever an American. Whenever this happens, it's always considered a long shot. Why is that, Heidi?
Well, we just did have a pope from the Americas. He was from South America, so probably unlikely that we would have another pope from the Western Hemisphere. Although, again, it's hard to make predictions because we don't know what will happen when they go in to do the voting, and it is done in secret, so we won't know unless there are leaks exactly what happens there. Certainly, the U.S. Church is influential and has a fair amount of money in their influence. But I would be very surprised if there was a pope from the United States. Let's put it that way.
Well, Heidi, thank you so much. Thank you for spending the time and explaining all of this to us.
Okay, thank you so much.
We'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Well, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, the Archbishop of Chicago, says he will attend the Pope's funeral and serve as part of the papal conclave. Cupich is one of 3 influential American bishops with ties to Chicago that will participate. The others are Chicago-born cardinals Robert Prevost and Wilton Gregory.
Meanwhile, this afternoon, Cardinal Cupich addressed the Catholic community with a video message remembering Pope Francis.
His leadership was a beacon of joy and hope, urging us to live fully in Christ's presence, to open our hearts to the stranger, and to walk together as a synodal church. While we mourn his passing, we also commend him to the tender mercy of Christ, which was the core of his faith and ministry. May he rest in peace.
Now, before leaving for Rome, Cardinal Cupich will preside over a memorial mass for Pope Francis. It'll take place this Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. at Holy Name Cathedral. It is open to the public. No reservations or tickets will be required. It will also be live streamed.